It's the little black V on some non-precision approach plates. It's the visual descent point, or VDP, and it causes a good deal of controversy amongst instrument-rated pilots. Here it is on the localizer approach to runway 17 in Tooele, Utah. On the profile view, it's clearly defined as the 2.1 DME on the localizer for the approach. What is a VDP? AIM 5-4-5 says it's a defined point on the final approach course, as it is here. It's found on non-precision straight-in approaches. In other words, you won't find it on a circling-only approach. It's the point from which a stabilized visual descent can be made from the MDA to the runway touchdown point. The distance is based on the lowest MDA published on the plate, and is based on either the angle of the visual glide slope indicator, in other words the PAPI or VASI, or the VDA, the vertical descent angle of the approach. In plain English, it's the procedure designer's attempt to show you when to begin a descent from the MDA on a non-precision approach. Non-precision approaches carry a risk of either hitting terrain or obstructions because a descent rate is started too early, or overrunning a runway if a descent is started too late. Let's take these parameters and see if we can see how the procedure designers have used them to figure out where to put the VDP on this approach. First, there's a defined point on the final approach course. We need to be able to identify it in the cockpit with something like DME or GPS. Next, we need to look at the MDA. The AIM says it's based on the lowest MDA, so keep this in mind if the MDA is higher for Cat C or D aircraft. It's designed to descend to the touchdown point, so we'll want to identify where that is. Finally, it's based on the procedure vertical descent angle. Here it's 3 degrees, but some approaches will use a different angle. So with this, the procedure designers have all the information needed to define a VDP. First, we're going to take an approach path using a 3-degree angle extending up from the runway touchdown point. This one's not to scale. Then, we want to show our MDA at the point where the descent should start. This is where our VDP will go. It's a lot easier to take height above touchdown, which is the MDA minus the touchdown zone elevation. So here it's 343 feet AGL. We'll use that. Now, this is starting to look like high school trigonometry, right? We need to know the ground distance here from the touchdown point to the VDP. The math involves taking the cotangent of the angle and multiplying it by a height of 343. And we get 6,545 feet for the ground distance. Definitely don't worry about this math, and we'll see an easier way to approximate this in a bit, but this is how the distance on the approach plate is determined. Now, this distance is from the VDP to the touchdown zone, but the approach plate doesn't show a touchdown zone. It shows distance from the runway threshold. So in order to get the distance to the threshold, we'll need to subtract the distance to the touchdown zone. Here's runway 17. The distance from the threshold to the beginning of the touchdown zone is a standard 500 feet. This is what we'll want to subtract. So we'll do that and get our ground distance from the VDP to the threshold of 6,045 feet, which is just barely short of 1 nautical mile. Okay, so now if we look at the approach profile view again, we see that after all this, it is indeed the distance charted from VDP to the runway threshold, 1 nautical mile. Now we shouldn't be going anywhere near trigonometry while flying an airplane, so we can use a rule of thumb to approximate the VDP by taking the height above touchdown and dividing it by 300. So here it's 343 divided by 300, which is 1.1 nautical miles. Not quite the same in part because it doesn't take the touchdown zone into consideration, but will always err on the conservative side. Now we don't really care about how to calculate the VDP on this approach because it's done for us, but as we'll see later, that's not always the case. Since a precision approach doesn't offer vertical guidance, it's typical for aircraft to arrive at the MDA, level off, and search for the runway. If the visibility is decent, we might gain sight of the runway pretty early on, before reaching the VDP. If we started descent from here, we'll need less than that calculated 3-degree descent rate in order to make it to the touchdown zone and prevent landing short. Recall what the regs say about leaving the MDA. 91.175C says we need to meet 3 conditions before going below the MDA. We need to be continuously in a position to make a descent to land, we need a flight visibility above minimums, and we need one of a list of visual references. This says nothing about going below the MDA before the VDP. It's perfectly legal to do so. It does carry added risks of hitting terrain and obstructions though starting an early descent, and without sight of the Pappy or Vazzy at this point, it might not be possible to stay clear of them. Also, the same AIM chapter that defines the VDP also states clearly that the pilot should not descend below the MDA prior to reaching the VDP. So again, we might not be breaking the regs in 91-175C by descending early, but it's strongly recommended we start that descent only at the VDP. How about if we gain sight of the runway after the VDP? We've delayed our descent as we're required to, but if the descent is started after the VDP, it'll require a steeper angle of descent to reach the same touchdown point. What does the reg say about steep descent rates? Nothing, except that the aircraft has to maintain a normal rate of descent. This is a bit subjective, but starting a descent slightly after the VDP doesn't seem to break the rules requiring a normal rate. We could maintain that same 3-degree descent rate. What this would do is carry us further down the runway, potentially past the touchdown zone. We'd be relying on our hopefully intimate knowledge of our aircraft performance, runway length and conditions, and density altitude to assure ourselves we won't overrun the runway, which adds risk, but also doesn't break any rules. Commercial operations under Part 121 and 135 require the descent rate to take the aircraft to the touchdown zone, which is the first 3,000 feet of runway. If we're Part 91, we don't need to follow this, but an argument could be made that landing past the first 3,000 feet of runway isn't exactly a normal maneuver, as the spirit of the reg seemed to call for. For these reasons, many pilots tend to play it conservative and treat the VDP as a decision point. In poor visibility, if the pilot can't spot the runway from the VDP, they'll decide to execute a missed approach. This decision is unchanged, even if further along they do gain sight of the runway. The missed will still happen, and will be executed at the missed approach point. There's an interesting implication to this practice. Looking at the same approach, the distance from the VDP to the runway threshold is 1 nautical mile. The visibility minimums are 1/2 statute mile. If the weather is at minimums, meaning we can legally shoot the approach, we won't have sight of the runway at the VDP, triggering our decision to go missed, even though when we arrive at the 1/2 statute mile point, we do gain sight of the runway and should be in our legal rights to land. Why would the FAA design approaches where the VDP is out beyond the legal visibility minimum? It's because one is not directly related to the other. Visibility minimums are a legal definition, whereas VDP is designed to aid you in your decision process. It's that old saying that what keeps you legal doesn't necessarily keep you safe. Let's look at an example where not using the VDP as a decision point might actually get us in legal trouble as well as mortal danger. Here's some details of the localizer approach to runway 28 at Baltimore. The visibility minimums are very low for a non-precision approach, RVR 2400. Our aircraft could be about here, well inside the VDP, which is 0.9 nautical miles from runway threshold, and just gain sight of the runway at minimums. Let's say we're doing a typical Category B approach speed of like 100 knots. If we want to make our touchdown zone the first 3,000 feet of runway from this point, at a height above touchdown listed at 477 feet, we'd need a descent rate of 893 feet per minute. The aggressive rate might not satisfy the requirement of 91-175 of a normal rate of descent. And if we used a less aggressive descent rate, we'd sail considerably past our touchdown zone, also not ideal. AIM 5-4-5 also cautions that a VDP might not always be published for a non-precision approach. This could be because of an obstacle penetrating the visual surface area, no way of determining the VDP point from the cockpit, or the design itself preventing a means to identify a VDP. Here's one of those approaches, the RNAV into runway 10 at Bear Lake County. Notice on the profile view there's no black V marking the visual descent point. We can use our rule of thumb to create our own. We take the height above touchdown for the non-precision LNAV minimum of 329, divide it by 300 to get 1.1 nautical miles from the runway. This would put our made-up VDP around here between ISIL and Glutz. We could use this as our decision point, but we need to ask ourselves why the FAA didn't just put one on here for us. Is it because of obstacles in the approach zone? Well, the presence of this light gray stipple here tells us that the visual path from the MDA to the runway is clear of obstacles, so that can't be it. Well, what if we plot these points out on a map? If we connect ISIL, our VDP, and the missed approach point Glutz, we see that it's considerably offset from the runway centerline. When we arrive at our calculated VDP on the approach, If we see the runway, we would need to make a right and then a left to maneuver onto final as we descend. A VDP is calculated based off a straight line distance, not one where we'll be making turns to get established. This maneuvering will increase our ground distance, so we need to be more conservative when making these VDPs ourselves. We can see on the chart too that on the plan view it says that the final approach course is offset from the runway almost 20 degrees. So while adhering to a VDP isn't a hard legal requirement the way an MDA or a missed approach point is, there are many reasons why pilots play it conservative and make their decision point at this spot on a non-precision approach. You can create your own on an approach that doesn't have one using the divide by 300 rule of thumb. Just remember to add in a bit of a buffer. If there isn't a VDP shown, there's a good reason for it. Also, since VDPs are derived from MDAs, if the MDA raises because of something like in-op equipment or an off-field altimeter used, the VDP might not be relevant anymore. Did you like this video? You're going to love Flight Insight IFR Ground School. Hours and hours of videos just like this, as well as hundreds of practice test questions based on the real thing with instructor feedback. Head on over to flight-insight.com/IFR right now.